Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
I do not seek here to convince anyone to become an atheist. Instead, I wish only to discuss what atheism actually is, and to dispel the all too frequent misconceptions regarding it. Many persons of religious persuasions assail atheism without truly understanding it. What they attack is not atheism as such, but rather a straw man constructed by themselves and consisting of every possible idea that they do not advocate. Much pointless negativity and intolerance might be avoided if only individuals of all intellectual persuasions became aware of the actual ideas of which atheism consists, the reasons for which many adhere to it, and common misconceptions held regarding it. To illustrate all of these will be my task in this and in subsequent videos. What is atheism? Dictionary.com defines atheism as 1. The doctrine or belief that there is no God. 2. Disbelief in the existence of a supreme being or beings. Further related definitions are provided by the American Heritage Dictionary. 1. Disbelief in or denial of the existence of God or gods. 2. The doctrine that there is no God or gods. Thus, there exists a simple test to distinguish an atheist from a theist. One only needs to ask an individual, do you believe in the existence of any kind of God or gods? If the person thus questioned answers in the affirmative, then he is a theist. If he answers in the negative, then he is an atheist. If he says he does not know, then he is an agnostic. An atheist does not believe in any kind of God or gods. But what exactly are these gods that atheists do not believe in? Princeton University's WordNet defines God as 1. The supernatural being conceived as the perfect and omnipotent and omniscient originator and ruler of the universe, the object of worship in monotheistic religions. 2. Any supernatural being worshipped as controlling some part of the world or some aspect of life, or who is the personification of a force. So, an atheist is an individual who does not believe that there exist any kinds of supernatural beings controlling any aspects of the world, of human lives, or of the entirety of existence. It is crucial to note that an atheist disbelieves specifically in the notion that a person controls these aspects of existence, or that the forces controlling them can be personified. An atheist does not necessarily reject the existence of impersonal forces controlling or guiding inanimate or animate aspects of the world. For instance, atheists can, and often do, believe that there exist natural laws of physics, of morality, of economics, and of biological evolution. Atheists can, and often do, believe in the existence of large macroscopic orders that characterize aspects of existence. What atheists reject is the idea that some non-human, superhuman, and supernatural person inaugurated those orders into being and/or actively controls them. Now that we know what atheism is, we will look in my subsequent videos at some common myths about atheism and atheists. During the past several days, I have received 2 interesting responses to my previous video presentations regarding atheism, both from individuals who do not believe in God, but also from individuals who question the use of the term atheist as applied to those who do not believe in God. And I believe that these responses make several interesting points that I would like to address and respond to. Furthermore, I would like to present my case as to why I think the term atheist is a necessary and useful term to use for reference to those who do not believe in God. Now, this may be an explanation for why I personally choose to use the term and the advantages that I perceive in doing so. If you disagree with me, then I do not necessarily think that you ought to adopt this use of this term. However, I do ask that you hear out my arguments and see if you perceive the advantages of using this term to outweigh the disadvantages. The comment that I received in an email states, "Only a theist can call someone an atheist. I cannot call myself an atheist because it presumes and validates theism, which is a contradiction. I not only reject the theist theories, but also reject the terms atheist and atheism as collateral products of an invalid theory. For example, if I were a member of a group who believed that extinct dodo birds are the controllers of the universe, I could name non-members anything I want. Let's call them dorkheads. Now, do you think non-members will start calling each other dorkheads? Of course not. That is why I am not an atheist." So this is the position of the author of the email. The author of a response to one of my videos on YouTube, an individual for whom I have great respect, also writes the following: "If you look at this issue from a different perspective, the term atheist is very odd, and perhaps even insulting. After all, there is no special term or semi-denigrating label for he who disbelieves in ghosts, or she who denies the existence of witches and vampires. Theists alone deserve the insulting nomenclature." Now, it is true that historically the term atheist began to be used as a pejorative against those who either openly did not believe in God, or as a way of members of some religious sects to accuse members of other religious sects of impiety or improper beliefs. And even the Wikipedia entry on atheism states that during the 16th and 17th centuries, nobody would have dreamed of calling himself an atheist. Indeed, the term was reserved for insults hurled among theists at each other when one group of theists believed that another group of theists did not have the proper set of beliefs. Now, given this historical origin, it's understandable why a lot of people who don't believe in any God would want to distance themselves from the label of atheist, which was originally conferred by the religious on the non-religious or even on other religious groups. But nevertheless, I think there are reasons why this term still ought to be used, and why I, at least personally, would like to use it in reference to myself. One such reason is that the most effective way to nullify a smear is to transform it in its meaning into either an innocuous description or a badge of pride. A great historical example of this is the word capitalism. Now, the word capitalism, in fact, originated as a smear against the free market economy. It was coined by Karl Marx. Karl Marx described capitalism as the economic system that rewards the owners of capital alone, and he posited, in contrast to capitalism, socialism, the economic system that rewards the entirety of society. Now, of course, I do not agree with the claim that socialism rewards the entirety of society, or that capitalism rewards the capital owners alone. But the solution to this kind of nomenclature is not to reject the term altogether. Rather, many distinguished free market economists and philosophers have managed to transform capitalism, originally meant as a smear term, into a badge of pride. So today one can call oneself a capitalist and be respected for it. One could call oneself a capitalist and say, yes, I believe in individual freedom, I believe in free trade, I believe in an economy devoid of government regulations. So, similarly, the same thing could be done with atheism, and indeed has been done since the 18th century Enlightenment. Because the word atheism itself is not necessarily a smear. It's not like the word dorkhead suggested by the author of the email. Indeed, atheism comes from the Greek atheos, which means without God or godless. There's nothing necessarily insulting about that. It just means one doesn't believe in God. Now, hypothetically, in response to the second comment I received, let us say that there were a term for a worldview that believed in ghosts. Let's call it ghostism. And the advocates of ghostism use a similar strategy to the one used by theists and call non-believers in ghosts aghostists. Now, I don't know if I would mind being called an aghostist, because contrary to the author of the email, I don't think that by accepting such a label, I would implicitly validate ghostism. Indeed, all I would be saying by calling myself an aghostist is that I do not believe the set of principles that is enunciated in ghostism. Another reason to call oneself an atheism is word economy, and furthermore, the ease of conceptualization. If I were to refer to myself in all cases as someone who does not believe in any God, then construction of sentences regarding my lack of this belief would be quite cumbersome. I would have to use 8 words instead of 1 in virtually everything I say. Now, the reason why the term atheism is convenient is because there are so many discussions regarding religion and regarding deities. For good or for evil, these discussions exist, and very often one finds these discussions thrust upon oneself. So, in order to be able to effectively enunciate one's non-belief in any gods, it is much more efficient to use 1 term instead of 8. Furthermore, the origins of such a term are understandable historically, because historically religion originated much earlier than atheism. Now, there were some Indian schools of atheism in the 6th century BC. There were also some famous Greek atheists in ancient Athens, such as Diagoras, in the 5th century BC. But most religions originated much earlier than this, and for much of history, religion was the rule, and non-belief in any kind of God was a serious exception to that rule, and naturally that exception attracted notice and a term for it. And even today, atheism is the exception rather than the rule. 3% of Americans only are atheists, and according to Wikipedia, about 2.3% of the world's population, whereas only about 11.9% of the world's population doesn't believe in God or doesn't know, so they are either atheists or agnostics. So, it is understandable historically why this term exists, and living at the point in history that we do, it is still necessary to at least confront the fact that this term is being used. Now, denying one's atheism has certain problems in discourse with others, because one risks being misunderstood. Because if one denies being an atheist, another individual might assume that one is therefore atheist, that one is therefore a believer in a God. And I would not want that confusion to be made with regard to myself. So, what I have illustrated are several distinct advantages to using the term atheist, or at least several reasons why it is necessary to do that. Now, I would understand if you would personally consider the benefits and costs of doing so to be different from the way I consider them, and I would encourage your response with regard to whether you think this term ought to be used or not, and why. The first commonly held misconception about atheism that I would like to dispel is the idea that atheists hate God. The word atheism originates from the Greek atheos, meaning godless. There is no hatred or even dislike of any god or gods implied in either the word or its origins. Atheism is not the same as antitheism, or opposition to gods and to those who believe in gods. Atheists do not actively despise any god, in part because it is difficult to despise what one does not believe to exist. Many monotheists make the mistake of alleging that atheists hate their god in particular. But if someone were to suggest that atheists hate Vishnu, or Zeus, or Thor, or Amun-Ra, such allegations would clearly be recognized as empirically false. Many atheists not only do not hate those deities, they enjoy reading myths and stories where such deities play an active role. In many such stories, the gods even behave in an admirable manner, and most atheists are ready to acknowledge this. What then would make the Christian, or Jewish, or Muslim god so different in their eyes? Indeed, absolutely nothing in an atheist's worldview needs necessarily prevent him from reading the texts of the monotheist faiths and deriving from them similar utility, enjoyment, and moral instruction to what he might derive from Hindu, Greek, Norse, or Egyptian mythology. When atheists read about gods, they evaluate the gods as literary characters. Those literary characters may behave admirably or not, and it is up to the individual atheist to judge the individual literary god in each particular case. What atheists are not ready to do, however, is to evaluate the morality or immorality of particular actions in a text based solely on whether any god performed them or abstained from them, praised or condemned them. Atheists are ready to condemn the Old Testament God's command that Saul exterminate the infants of Amalek, just as they are prepared to criticize Athena's decision to turn Arachne into a spider for being a better weaver than the goddess. Consider both of these scenarios. God, in the Old Testament, explicitly instructed Saul to commit genocide, to kill all the men and all the women and all the children of Amalek, and additionally to raze the city and destroy all the cattle. When Saul almost carried out God's command, except he took the best cattle and offered them as a sacrifice to God, God punished Saul because Saul did not fully carry out God's wishes. Now, all of you watching this video, whether you're atheists or Christians or Muslims or Jews or something else, will agree with me that genocide is wrong, no matter who conducts it, no matter on whose authority it is based. So if a literary character, like the Old Testament God, because this is not the God you believe in, commands a person to exterminate an entire settlement and the infants of that settlement, we can agree that this is objectively immoral. Similarly, Athena turned Arachne into a spider out of sheer jealousy that Arachne was a better weaver than Athena was, a more productive individual. Envy of productive individuals and punishing productive individuals for being productive are immoral, and we can recognize that objectively. We do not need the authority of a particular deity to praise virtuous actions or to condemn outright immoral ones. In my prior presentation, I discussed that atheism does not necessarily imply the hatred of any god of any religion. However, even many people who grant this would claim that atheists nevertheless hate people who believe in God or gods. Now, atheists do not believe in any gods, but virtually all atheists believe in the existence of some kind of moral standards for human behavior. Since they do not believe in any gods, atheists do not believe that moral standards originate from gods. Thus, in an atheist's view, whether somebody else believes in a god is as irrelevant to that person's morality as his color of hair or his preferred flavor of ice cream. What is relevant, however, is whether an individual's actions show him to be a fundamentally good and moral person. Many atheists will disagree regarding what this means, but they will concur that an individual's religious convictions are not a determinant of his moral character. Again, those who would condemn theists simply because the latter believe in a god are not atheists, but rather antitheists. If a person's religious convictions have nothing in common with his adherence to the atheist's moral standard of choice, then the consistent atheist will disregard religious convictions altogether when forming his judgments of others. An atheist is often as likely to find good people among the religious as among fellow atheists, and he might often prefer the company of some of the former to that of some of the latter. I know that this is the case for me, and it is the case for many other atheists of my acquaintance as well. Atheists do not necessarily dislike any particular religion or its adherents. What atheists detest, however, is religious bigotry, hypocrisy, and intolerance. Whenever any group of individuals seeks to impose its views on others by force, or uses the rhetoric of religion as justification for coercing, expropriating, and tyrannizing over others, the conscientious atheist will be outraged, as he should be. But also, many conscientious Christians and Jews and Muslims will be outraged over the same decisions made by religious bigots, because enforcing any kind of religious conformity is a violation of people's inalienable rights to believe what their conscience and their reason dictate. And that is a belief that atheists respect, and that atheists can agree with religious individuals to respect and honor. One of the most common and most grievously mistaken myths about atheism is that atheists advocate socialism, totalitarianism, or the welfare state. While it is true that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels did not believe in any god, atheism as such has no necessary implications in the political realm, other than perhaps an opposition to any integration between church and state, which is a stance shared by many religious individuals as well. Naturally, if somebody does not believe in a particular god or in a particular theology, he would not want belief in that god or theology imposed on others by the state. There do exist socialist atheists and welfare statist atheists, but there also exist conservative atheists, libertarian atheists, and atheists adhering to virtually every other political creed. Indeed, atheism is much older than virtually any prevalent political philosophy of our time. The first known famous atheist was the ancient Greek thinker Diagoras in the late 5th century BC. In more recent times, atheism was espoused by such thinkers as the Enlightenment thinker, the Baron de Holbach, the analytic philosopher Bertrand Russell, and Ayn Rand, the founder of objectivism. Truly, atheists are historically represented within a tremendous range of political and philosophical movements, and it is impossible to classify all atheists under a single political or ethical umbrella. Indeed, the disagreements among atheists as to what constitutes moral behavior or a proper social order can often exceed in their extent the disagreements between some atheists and some religious individuals on these issues. Nothing prevents an atheist from adhering to a philosophy of individual rights, limited government, and free markets. Murray Rothbard, one of the 20th century's most prolific free market economists and libertarian political theorists, was an atheist, as is the psychiatrist Dr. Thomas Szasz, who opposes state control over individuals' mental health. Indeed, according to columnist Alan Karuba, who is not himself an atheist, American atheists are more likely to object to abuses of power by government than most people. Conservative and libertarian political values, smaller and less intrusive government, fiscal prudence, laissez-faire capitalism, and individualism would seem to suit most but not all atheists better than some form of socialism or one-world government philosophy. My advice to religious conservatives who believe in free markets and in individual liberty, but are suspicious of atheists and accuse atheists of having socialistic or totalitarian tendencies, is to rethink their position, because there are many atheists who could prove valuable allies in the struggle to make our government more limited and give us back some of our economic and personal freedoms that have been lost through the growth of government. And this is an important struggle in this world that does not necessarily relate to one's theological beliefs or beliefs about whether there is a next world or how that next world might look like. It is essential to have as many allies in this struggle as possible. And if we have agreement on the political desirability of limited government, then why do we need to ostracize each other over theological beliefs or lack thereof? I think there are far more important things to focus on, and for all of you religious conservatives watching this video, I would advise you to accept a similar approach. One of the most common myths about atheism, a myth that is highly reiterated by many of religious persuasions, is that atheists do not believe in objective moral standards because a belief in objective moral standards requires a belief in some kind of deity that is the originator of morality. But this is an extremely false misrepresentation of atheism, and if one meets actual atheists, one will quickly recognize that atheists hold a variety of moral standards that they consider to be universally valid, objective, and absolute. And they also have numerous well-developed approaches to arriving at these moral standards. So, what are some of the ways by which one could arrive at an understanding of morality without any reference to a deity? One can employ natural law theory, as exemplified in the works of Aristotle, John Locke, and Murray Rothbard. Now, these three thinkers, at the very least, did not believe in the same God. Aristotle believed in a prime mover, God, who thinks about his own thoughts, and doesn't do much else, certainly does not interfere actively in human affairs. John Locke was a Christian who believed that rights were given to men by their Creator. But Murray Rothbard, in his extensive study of natural law, took all of the political and ethical elements from Aristotle's theory and from Locke's theory and formulated them in a manner that did not require any kind of reference to God. For Rothbard, natural law is quite abstract and impersonal and universally binding. Alternatively, one can espouse utilitarianism, as did Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. Or one could argue for the evolutionary origins of morality, in the manner of Herbert Spencer and Friedrich Hayek. Hayek believed that moral codes in a society evolved as practical rules of conduct that made particular societies more likely to survive than others. According to Hayek, initially, there have been some societies that were cannibalistic, or where incest was widely practiced, but these societies fairly rapidly died out, or were supplanted by more viable societies where incest was for some reason a taboo, or cannibalism was forbidden. And people learned from their own experiences to shun these immoral practices, and they might have developed some kinds of religious or non-religious explanations so that most of the common people would understand that these practices are to be abstained from. Or, like the Enlightenment thinkers and Ayn Rand, one can see morality as originating from rational self-interest. It is in an individual's own long-term interest, all things considered, to be a moral person, because then he will be healthier, wealthier, and happier as a result. Furthermore, one can follow the empiricist consequentialism of Milton Friedman and try to arrive at morality by observing the outcomes of particular actions and human institutions. So, which actions would lead to the most desirable results, to human prosperity, to human happiness? Which institutions maximize wealth? Which institutions maximize social cooperation? Those are the institutions and the behaviors that we ought to embrace. One can also be a rationalist and try to deduce morality from first principles, like René Descartes assumed when he started with his first principle, I think, therefore I am, and from his own existence deduced the remainder of his philosophical and moral system. Alternatively, like William James, one can be a pragmatist and conceive of morality as a set of rules that happen to work in a pragmatic sense, however one defines work to fit the objectives that one happens to have. An essay of mine titled "Morality Does Not Require Religion" provides further discussion of why a belief in any god or gods is not required for an individual to behave morally. Another of my essays, "Incentives for Moral Behavior," examines the real-world motivations of individuals of a broad variety of persuasions, religious or otherwise, to act morally. Both of these essays explain that there is, in fact, an absolute objective morality that transcends particular philosophical or ideological persuasions, and that many people of broadly varying persuasions, in their actual behaviors, approximate and discover independently the same moral rules and principles. So, if you wish to obtain a further understanding of this subject, I encourage you to explore these essays. It is frequently claimed that atheism itself is just another religion, but I beg to differ. Not only is atheism not a religion, by itself it is not even a philosophy or worldview. Atheism is simply a negative, a disbelief in a deity. It does not imply a positive creed of any sort. Atheists disagree extensively amongst themselves regarding metaphysical questions such as whether the universe had a beginning in time, or whether it always existed. They disagree regarding epistemological issues, such as the proper sources of and criteria for human knowledge. Atheists range from strict deductive rationalists to complete empiricists, to those who reject the empiricist-rationalist dichotomy altogether. The only epistemological idea atheists agree on is that truth cannot be obtained through divine revelations or commandments. However, some atheists will acknowledge the tremendous value and truth contained in the moral systems accompanying many religions. Nothing necessarily bars an atheist from adhering to some or most of Christian or Jewish moral teachings. If he agrees with them, however, it will not be because God told him to, but because he perceives other extra-religious justifications for these ideas and standards of conduct. Now, in terms of ethical or political views, atheists can vary dramatically as well. In my prior two presentations, I discussed how atheists can be libertarians or conservatives, or, on the other hand, socialists or welfare statists. In my refutation of the myth that atheists reject objective moral standards, I presented a wide range of secular moral philosophies by which different atheists could arrive at different ideas of what an objective morality is. And yet, how many of them seem to approximate the same moral behaviors despite adhering to dramatically differing philosophies. So, atheism by itself is not a worldview. One could be an atheist empiricist, for instance, or an atheist rationalist. If we are referring to epistemology, one could be an atheist communist in politics, or on the other hand, an atheist libertarian. So, it is false to say that atheism is a religion, because a religion is a positive creed with very extensive contents, and it is a creed that has a lot to say about metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, and politics. Atheism as such has very little to say on these subjects, except that it rejects the existence of a god or gods. Many people who are not well informed about atheism like to turn atheists into scapegoats for the political suppressions of religious beliefs and religious demonstrations that have been occurring in Western societies recently. The idea that atheists seek to politically suppress anybody's freedom of religious belief and worship, however, is completely false. It is not only not in line with what atheists actually believe, but even if atheists wanted to politically suppress anybody's freedom of religion, they would not be able to do so. Statistics compiled in 2005 show that the combined number of atheists, agnostics, and non-believers in God in the United States ranges from 3% to 9% of the population. When explicit atheists are considered alone, this percentage is likely to be at the lower end of this range. The columnist Alan Karuba writes, "As best as can be determined, only 3% of Americans are atheists. What matters most to them is their personal integrity. They are, almost by definition, the least authoritarian of groups you can find, and the least likely to attempt to convert someone to their views." Now, atheists are a demographically insignificant minority, and do not have the political power to suppress anybody's religious beliefs even if they wanted to. Furthermore, virtually no prominent politicians in the United States are known to be atheists, perhaps with one or two exceptions, and this fact indicates how little political influence atheists actually have. So, for all religious conservatives who believe that the atheists are responsible for the infringement of their religious freedoms, I would advise them to think again. Because where are these phantom atheist politicians and phantom atheist constituencies that are imposing these restrictions? I don't see them. I'm not aware of them, and I'm certainly not one of them. My personal belief is that one should be permitted to hold any belief and to practice the implications of that belief, provided that this belief does not impose coercive harms on other human beings. So, in the words of the great Voltaire, I may disagree with what you say, but I will defend to the death your right to say it, and that includes belief in any kind of deity, even if I consider that deity to be non-existent, even if I consider the moral code that is based on that deity to be mistaken in many respects. Any attempts to infringe upon the religious views and practices of some Americans are currently made by other individuals who claim to be religious, and often of the same religion as those whose rights they seek to infringe. Indeed, much of the opposition to religious expression on government and on private property stems from those who endeavor to suppress speech, ceremonies, and displays by some religious groups for fear of, quote, offending other religious groups. So it is not atheism that is responsible for suppressions of public religious demonstrations, rather it is political correctness. The idea that no kinds of behaviors ought to be permitted, even on private property, that could remotely offend the sensibilities of some religious group or some constituency. And this kind of ideology is antithetical to human liberty. It is antithetical to freedom of speech. It is antithetical to freedom of conscience. And I believe that many conscientious atheists who recognize the value of liberty will find allies in religious conservatives who seek to protect their religious freedoms. And therefore, I urge the religious conservatives not to make scapegoats out of people who could be genuinely helpful to the very endeavors that they're trying to accomplish. Why do atheists reject the existence of any kind of deity? Here I will attempt to give 4 common reasons which many people use to explain their non-belief in any god or gods. Personally, I consider all 4 of these reasons to be influential, though not exhaustive, in determining my atheism and in influencing the way in which I view the world. Reason number 1 is lack of evidence for God's existence. Simply put, atheists do not see any kind of evidence, proof, warrant, or demonstration that suggests that any kind of deity might actually exist. Atheists do not observe any phenomena that can only be explained by invoking a deity. If every aspect of existence, from atoms to morality, can be accounted for without any mention of a god, then belief in a god is simply superfluous, and adds nothing substantive to one's understanding. A vital principle, Occam's razor, states that entities should not be multiplied beyond necessity, and that all other things equal, the simplest explanation for a phenomenon is the correct one. So far, atheists have been unable to find any phenomenon for whose explanation the concept of a God is indispensable. And of course, numerous phenomena have been suggested by theists throughout the ages, anything from the origin of life to the source of morality. But atheists have been able to find scientific, philosophical explanations for these questions and many others. The second reason why many people adhere to atheism is a lack of, quote, faith. And I use the term faith with caution because this term has multiple meanings, many of which atheists do not reject. Atheists can and often do exhibit faith in the sense of trust in other people, or in institutions, or in natural phenomena. They also exhibit faith in the sense of a belief in some kind of idea. They do not, however, exhibit faith in the sense of belief that is not based on proof. This is one definition of faith that is provided by dictionary.com. Many religious individuals will readily admit that there exists no evidence for the existence of any kind of God. They will then claim that they believe in a God nonetheless, because they possess this faculty of faith. The only thing an atheist can say in response is that he possesses no such faculty, and therefore cannot make the leap to the same conclusion that the religious person makes. A third common reason for atheism is a lack of convincing arguments for God's existence. And this lack of convincing arguments, of course, has the majority of theists to blame for it. Atheists are not necessarily closed to the possibility of ever believing in a God, but they require that they be presented with a convincing reason for why they should. Once again, it is possible that anything I say is incorrect, but it is necessary for you, if you believe that I am incorrect, to persuade me otherwise, and to do it in a manner that actually convinces me. While many religious individuals have sought to present arguments for belief, atheists have largely not found them compelling. This does not mean that theists ought to stop trying. Rather, they should recognize which arguments have failed to convince atheists, despite having been tried time and again. August Berkshire offers a useful list of some of these in his 21 Unconvincing Arguments for God. It is an essay that I advise all of you to read, and it is listed in the links accompanying the comments for this presentation. When theists begin to present new arguments that encourage atheists to approach the question of the existence of God in a hitherto unexplored manner, they can be sure that many atheists will give such ideas serious consideration. If you present something new, something that I haven't heard before, or even a new understanding of what the term God means, perhaps an understanding that removes some of the apparent or existent logical contradictions in prior versions or interpretations of this term, then you will certainly have my ear, and the ear of many other atheists as well, and at least there can be a constructive discussion there. A fourth reason why many people choose atheism is a desire to avoid rituals and institutional entanglements. Most religious systems are not merely networks of abstract and interrelated beliefs. They also entail adherence to a specific social hierarchy and a highly particular set of customs, rituals, and ceremonies. Many atheists simply do not wish to recognize the authority of any particular group of men who call themselves priests or pastors. They do not wish to undertake a certain set of dietary prohibitions or regulations regarding how they must or must not spend certain days of the week. Atheists tend to dislike entangling abstract beliefs with concrete institutions, as the institutions will often do great discredit to even the very principles they claim to uphold. It is true that a person who wishes to avoid such institutional entanglements is still in theory free to believe in the existence of some kind of deity. Benjamin Franklin tried to do this. However, most gods are so constructed, and of course atheists believe that gods are human constructs, as to require highly concrete and particular forms of obedience, such as attendance at a church or temple, the offering of certain material sacrifices, the singing of specific songs, the uttering of specific sequences of words, and adherence to extremely thorough prescriptions governing everything from birth to marriage to the conduct of meals. An individual is free to invent a god that does not require such forms of worship, but at that point he would be quite explicitly creating a deity, not finding an already existing deity outside of himself. It is as difficult to believe in the existence of a god of one's own imagining as it is to think that a fictional character that one has just put into a story actually lives and breathes. And I myself have been an author of novels and short stories, and from personal experience I can tell you that it is impossible to convince oneself of the reality of the characters whose existence one has just written into a page. To think that these characters whom one has just concocted out of one's head are real entities would require at least some kind of doubtful sanity. And I believe the same holds for trying to invent a god of one's own. So many atheists, not finding a suitable institutional structure accompanying a particular religion, or simply wishing to avoid institutional entanglements of any kind, will just reject the existence of a god altogether. Once again, these 4 reasons are not exhaustive, and they do not explain the motivations of all atheists. However, I do believe that they are significant in the thought processes of many atheists, and I believe that both sides of the discussion regarding religion will benefit from considering these reasons and addressing them. This presentation continues on my previous video, titled 4 Common Reasons for Atheism, and gives 2 additional prevalent reasons for why many people choose atheism. Once again, even these 6 reasons put together are not necessarily exhaustive. However, I do believe that they are significant reasons in the minds of many atheists, and that they deserve consideration. Reason number 5 is upbringing and fundamental intellectual framework. Just as many individuals become certain of their religious convictions from being raised in a particular faith, so do many atheists lack a belief in a deity, in part because they were not raised in such a belief. None of their parents, and few other adult authority figures in their lives, actively encouraged or cultivated a belief in a god, so no such belief emerged. In the meantime, the young implicit atheists developed an entire worldview, which did not require the presence of a god to explain any aspect of existence. And while atheism was not their positive worldview was atheistic in the sense that it did not contain any deities in it. Many of the conclusions which an atheist with this background has arrived at and implemented in his everyday life are so deeply rooted in his basic worldview that to introduce an entirely foreign element like a god into such a worldview would overturn everything and leave the atheist confused and skeptical of the morality of even elementarily good actions. Many of the same ethical and practical conclusions are of course consistent with both belief and disbelief in a god. But there is no guarantee that abandoning an intellectual framework that took a lifetime to develop will lead the atheist to develop another equally formidable framework in a much shorter time period. The same argument, of course, applies to a religious individual with respect to his faith, especially if such a faith underlies the majority of his ethical and practical conduct. It is not advisable for him to abandon his religious framework unless he is certain to replace it with a more extensively developed non-religious one. Otherwise, he might lose the motive to pursue actions that are moral irrespective of their justification. And for me, and for many other conscientious atheists, what matters more about an individual is not the content of his abstract beliefs, but the morality of his behavior, whether he is a fundamentally honest person, fundamentally civil person, a person of integrity, who abstains from robbing and killing others, who abstains from the initiation of force, who abstains from adultery and other vices. And if one exhibits that kind of morality, then it is of little importance how one justifies it, provided that a justification can be persuasive and compelling and sustainable. Reason number 6 for atheism is the conviction that certain ideas about gods are self-contradictory. Many atheists take issue with the specific attributes that believers ascribe to particular gods. This especially applies to the monotheist faiths, where God is most often characterized as simultaneously omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, an inherent contradiction according to many atheists. Furthermore, many atheists are skeptical of the idea that a God created the universe, particularly if they do not believe that the universe ever was or needed to be created. When examining the gods of other faiths, deities somewhat more limited in their powers, atheists often perceive contradictions in the formulations of those gods as well, or at least a lack of empirical evidence that the gods have the powers that they are thought to have, or dwell in locations described as their homes. For instance, despite numerous individuals having climbed Mount Olympus, Zeus has been nowhere to be found. As atheists vary dramatically in the specific content of their positive convictions, they will diverge substantially as to the more specific arguments they will present for their disbelief in a God. My own 5 arguments for the non-existence of God, which is linked to in the resources section accompanying this video, are offered as some of my personal reasons for atheism, though they are not necessarily shared by atheists at large. In conclusion, atheism has too often been unjustly smeared as an opposition to morality, or a totalitarian dogma advocating mass extermination of religious persons. It is nothing of the sort. It is neither a religion nor a philosophy, but rather the absence of one particular kind of belief. In the positive contents of their worldviews, atheists diverge from one another as dramatically as they might from certain religious worldviews. Many atheists might find closer intellectual kinship with some religious persons than with some other atheists. Nothing in atheism dictates opposition to religion or intolerance of religious individuals. On the contrary, there exists a tremendous potential for positive exchanges, both material and intellectual, between those who believe in a God and those who do not. While some atheists are indeed of dubious moral standing, so is a roughly proportional number among the adherents of any particular religion. It is not atheism or religiosity that leads some to desire to oppress, coerce, intimidate, slander, or demean others. Rather, it is sheer savagery and inhumanity. Against this inhumanity, the good persons of every creed can unite.
Atheism is older than Christianity. The first explicit atheists in Western civilization can be found among the ancient Greeks. The word atheism stems from the Greek atheos, or without God. The first self-proclaimed atheist was Diagoras of Melos, who lived in ancient Athens in the 5th century BC. Diagoras was a student of Democritus, the atomist philosopher. He denied the existence of the official gods of the Athenian city-state, since the gods did not seem to punish many vicious acts that they were supposed to have condemned. Just as religious intolerance plagues much of the world today, so did it then. Diagoras was exiled from Athens for his overtly atheistic statements and spent the remainder of his life in Corinth. Circa 300 BC, Theodorus the atheist of Cyrene denied the existence of any gods and believed in a this-worldly purpose to life. Theodorus argued that the goal of life was to pursue joy and escape grief, rather than seeking to worship any gods or obtaining any kind of afterlife. Theodorus made the connection between prudence and joy, as well as between folly and grief, suggesting that it is our own wise conduct that leads to our joy, and our own foolish conduct that leads to our grief. Later writers, including Cicero, and Plutarch gave Theodorus the name Atheist, whence he became known as Theodorus the Atheist. For his free-thinking ways, Theodorus was banished from both Cyrene and Athens, and as an ambassador apparently offended a few rulers with whom he tried to share his ideas. Through his book, On the Gods, Theodorus inspired the great philosopher Epicurus, who further developed Theodorus's orientation toward pursuing happiness and avoiding grief. Epicurus himself, while not an explicit atheist, formed a philosophy of life that atheists would have no problem with. If there were gods, argued Epicurus, they had nothing to do with human affairs and left people to fend for themselves, a point of view resurrected by the deists of the 18th century. Atheism was unfortunately stifled in the Western world by the rise of fanatical and intolerant strains of Christianity during the late Roman Empire. In 381 AD, the Roman Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree banning any religious or non-religious views departing from his official interpretation of Christian doctrine. Explicit atheism did not fully revive until the late 18th century, with such thinkers as the Baron d'Holbach and the Marquis de Condorcet.
I've recently been asked why I prefer to call myself an atheist rather than an agnostic. And I believe a thorough response to that question is warranted. Atheism and agnosticism are two very different approaches toward the question of whether or not there exists any god or gods. An agnostic says merely that he does not know whether there exists any god or gods, and he's not going to make any assumptions in favor of the affirmative position or the negative position. An agnostic does not say that he does not believe in any god. He simply says that he cannot answer the question as to whether one exists, so for the time being, at least until he's convinced on the matter one way or the other, he's not going to make any commitments. He will not attend any particular church, he will not follow the tenets of any particular faith, at least not because they were commanded by a particular deity. And he will also abstain from categorically denying that any god or gods exist. An atheist, on the other hand, believes that he knows that there is no god or gods, and he believes that he can demonstrate this knowledge in some fashion. Now, I call myself an atheist, and I call myself an atheist because I believe that I know that no god or gods exist. Now, in some cases, it is because the concept of God, especially as defined by the three major monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, is a self-contradictory concept. So, logically, I believe that it is impossible for such a God to exist. Now, as an example of the contradiction, consider that this God is defined to be simultaneously omnipotent and omniscient. Now, there are problems with this definition. Let us say that one posed a question to this simultaneously omnipotent and omniscient God, and the question would go like this: God, because you are omniscient, can you tell me which team will win the next World Series game? Will it be Team A or Team B? And God, in his omniscience, will say Team A, or he will say Team B. And I would continue, well, God, if you're omnipotent, can you change the outcome of this game so that the other team will win? And either way that God responds, he will be trapped, and the concept cannot be rescued. Because if he responds, yes, I can change the outcome, then God might be omnipotent, at least within the parameters of this dilemma, but he will then not have been omniscient, because he will have told me the wrong answer to my original question. Because if God can change the outcome, and he does, then it will be the other team that will actually win the World Series, not the team that God initially said would win the World Series. Now, if God answers that he cannot change the outcome, then obviously God is not omnipotent, even though he might still be omniscient within the parameters of this particular dilemma. There are other reasons why I believe that the concepts of omnipotence and omniscience and omnibenevolence and infinite magnitudes of any quality whatsoever are logical impossibilities. But a more thorough discussion of that follows in my essay, 5 Arguments for the Non-Existence of God, which is linked in the description to this video. If you're interested in a deeper presentation of a few of my reasons for being an atheist, then I encourage you to explore that essay, as well as some of my other writings and videos on the subject. But suffice it to say, I, as an atheist, have no disrespect whatsoever for agnostics. Agnostics may genuinely not know whether there's a God or not, and as rational, autonomous thinking individuals, I would not wish them to commit to any position until they independently examine all the arguments from all the sides and decide for themselves whether or not they want to believe in a God. Other agnostics may just consider the issue irrelevant to their own particular individual contexts and their own lives, and that might make sense because to many the idea of God seems so remote and distant from more pressing everyday concerns that it's perfectly reasonable why they wouldn't explore the issue in enough depth to warrant either acceptance or rejection of this idea. If, for instance, they are focused on running a successful business or managing a family or pursuing other kinds of studies and all of their time is occupied with this, then surely one cannot insist on them making a decision on this very complex, multifaceted, and important issue. One would at least hope that any decision they make would be an informed decision, and withholding a fixed, permanent commitment one way or the other is quite understandable if they have neither the time nor resources to devote to it. Many good people I know are agnostics, and none of this is meant to slight any agnostics, but I believe that I myself have considered these issues in sufficient depth and for a long time, and I have come to believe that no God or gods exists, nor can possibly exist. Therefore, I call myself an atheist.
Religion has existed for as long as recorded history can document, and it will almost certainly continue to exist for the foreseeable future, although the contents of religious doctrine will evolve in accordance with changing economic and societal circumstances and developments in prevalent understandings of morality. A reasonable secularist does not seek to wipe out religion, as this would be an impossible task that would only meet severe resistance and endanger the prospects for the humane, peaceful coexistence of all persons. Moreover, revolutionary changes in any person's worldview are undesirable, as they uproot him from sophisticated and decently functioning understandings of moral action that can develop on the basis of a wide variety of underlying philosophical frameworks. Any changes in a person's philosophy need to be gradual and thoroughly considered, and thus nobody concerned with maintaining the peace of human interactions should wish for an instantaneous overhaul of all religious persuasions. Instead of fighting the religious or deconverting them, the reasonable secularist needs to attempt to, in the course of discussion and argumentation, reach an understanding of proper this-worldly behavior that he and the majority of religious people can at least roughly agree on. In order for this to happen, it is not necessary for religious belief to disappear. Rather, it simply needs to be expressed humanely and tolerantly. The following is a list of expectations that the secularist should be able to reasonably make on all religious persons. Many religious persons, in fact, already adhere to these points, and thus should not be actively opposed in the expression and practice of their beliefs. Here is the minimal secular agenda regarding religious belief. To ensure the peaceful and harmonious coexistence of all individuals, all persons of religious persuasions should voluntarily adopt the following understandings. 1. A recognition that it is possible for non-religious people to behave morally, and to behave just as morally, if not more so, as any religious person. 2. A renunciation of all coercive apparatuses, governmental or private, for the imposition of religious beliefs and practices on those who do not wish to receive them. 3. A renunciation of all coercive apparatuses, governmental or private, for the suppression of non-religious beliefs and practices. 4. A renunciation of support for coercively obtained funding for religious or religiously affiliated institutions. 5. A renunciation of any religious criteria for the holding of leadership positions in public office or in private businesses which have no direct relation to religious or philosophical activity. 6. A recognition that lifestyles and behaviors which are objectionable on a solely religious basis can only be legitimately countered by private, non-coercive efforts, and not through the use of governmental or private coercive power. The adoption of the minimal secular agenda regarding religious belief will greatly de-escalate the current culture wars and facilitate maximum freedom for both the religious and the non-religious. Moreover, it will enable more civil, tolerant, and respectful interactions among individuals of a wide variety of philosophical persuasions.
Certain less respectable persons of religious persuasions have given me quite a bit of flack over my fairly common sense claim that it is indeed possible for atheists to be moral individuals, and that many atheists do hold objective moral standards, arriving at those standards from a variety of philosophical persuasions. Here, I will argue to those individuals who have thus attacked my fairly common sense and moderate claims, and I will argue before them that not only are their assertions that atheists cannot be moral plainly wrong, these assertions are also unchristian, and in fact manifest certain heresies that are rejected by virtually all mainstream schools of Christian thought. Calling all atheists immoral betrays an ignorance not only of basic morality or basic human decency, but also of the very Christian theology that these people are claiming to adhere to. Now, the argument that all atheists are immoral goes something like this. Without the fear of eternal punishment in hell, or the desire for an eternal reward in heaven, why be moral? There's no reason to be moral because there are no consequences that follow from it. Well, first of all, this is patently absurd. If you act immorally, there are going to be consequences in this world. If you kill someone, you bet there are going to be people who notice. If you rob from someone, you bet there are going to be individuals who will seek restitution for that stolen property. If you lie to someone, you bet your reputation is going to be impaired. And furthermore, your own opinion of yourself, your own self-esteem and self-image will be damaged beyond repair once you pass a certain threshold of immoral behavior. So, it is patently absurd to suggest that for somebody who doesn't believe in God, there are no consequences to behaving immorally. But even more than that, within a Christian framework, it is illegitimate to say that the only reason for behaving morally is either fear of eternal punishment or the desire for an eternal reward. There is virtually no mainstream, intelligent Christian theological belief that holds that fear of eternal punishment or the desire for an eternal reward is a proper motivation for moral behavior. I'm going to explore a few mainstream schools of Christian thought here. First, there are the Calvinists and their various offshoots. The Calvinists believe in foreordained salvation. They believe in predestination, in essence. That is to say, God has already chosen who is going to be saved and who is going to be damned, and there's not one thing humans can do about it. No matter how they behave in their own lives, that's not going to affect by one iota their chance of being saved or not. So in the Calvinist view, your behaving morally or not will have nothing to do with your salvation at all. So at least in that perspective, the idea that you must behave morally in order to get into heaven fails miserably. Then there's the mainstream Protestant perspective, originating from Luther and held by many Protestant sects today. The mainstream Protestant perspective says that your good works do not lead to your salvation. Rather, it is faith in God alone that leads to your salvation, and you perform good works not in order to be saved, but because you already know that you are saved from your faith in God, and you perform these good works out of love for your for your fellow men, and your desire to demonstrate Christian virtue. Then there's the Catholic perspective. The Catholic perspective holds that both faith and good works are necessary for salvation, but you can't perform good works in a mercenary manner expecting to be saved as a result of that. As a matter of fact, the Catholic Church currently condemns the practices of the Catholic Church of the 15th and 16th century of selling indulgences to people who essentially did not act based on the principles of the Catholic faith, but expected to pay the church enough money and thereby expect to be saved. Those people expected to use morality as solely an instrument for getting into heaven or avoiding hell or perhaps shortening their stay in purgatory. And current Catholic doctrine concedes that this is not a legitimate way to treat morality. If you engage in moral behavior solely for the purpose of getting into heaven or avoiding eternal punishment, God will see through that, and God will punish you for that. Then there's the Eastern Orthodox perspective. Every argument from a believer in the Eastern Orthodox faith that I've encountered states that it is great folly and presumption for a human being to think that he can look into the mind of God and figure out whom God is going to save or damn. And consequently, it must be grave folly and presumption to think that God will automatically save you if you engage in what you consider moral behavior, and also that God will necessarily damn those who are atheists or those whom you consider to be atheists or those whom you consider to be sinners, because you simply don't know the mind of God. That's the essential thrust of the Eastern Orthodox argument. So, I've shown from the Calvinist perspective, from the mainstream Protestant perspective, from the mainstream Catholic perspective, and from the Eastern Orthodox perspective, that the idea that the sole purpose for morality is to get an eternal reward or avoid an eternal punishment is not a legitimate Christian idea. So, what is, then, a good motive to behave morally? From a Christian perspective or from an atheistic perspective? Legitimately speaking, you should value moral action because of other kinds of consequences. If you're a Christian, you should perform moral actions because you like to, because it's in accord with your principles, because it would demonstrate certain virtues on your part, and will show you that you're a certain kind of human being, a kind of human being whom you would respect, have a positive image of. Similarly for atheists, I don't act morally because I expect a direct correlation between my actions and the reward for those actions. I do believe that positive consequences will ensue from that, but I also have a certain image of myself as a human being. If that image is violated through my own immoral action, I will have to live with that. And that will not be very comfortable, because while I might run from other people and their opinions of me, and I might disguise my own deeds so that other people might be temporarily deceived, I cannot run from myself, and I cannot deceive myself. And that is my motivation for acting morally, so that I can be comfortable with my own identity as an individual. And I believe that that kind of approach is transferable across numerous philosophical perspectives, be they religious or non-religious. It's a much healthier approach than seeking an eternal reward and having that being one's sole motivation to act morally, or avoiding eternal punishment and having that being one's sole motivation for acting morally. Therefore, if you are going to call yourself a Christian, I'm not going to stop you. I'm not going to try to change your religious beliefs. But if you're going to call yourself a Christian, act like one. And actually find out what your particular brand of Christianity says about morality and who can be moral. Because the claim that atheists cannot be moral is not even a Christian claim. It is simply an ignorant and bigoted claim, propagated by people who do not display genuine Christian virtue, but who are rather suffused with hate.
In this presentation, we are going to discuss the origins of morality, namely, where good and evil come from. Now, I'm an atheist, and I will be presenting an atheistic perspective on the origins of morality. Namely, I do not believe that morality originates from what is often called the will of God. That is, the say-so of an allegedly all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good cosmic ruler whom people call God. Now, I believe that grounding morality in say-so of anybody, human or allegedly divine, is essentially arbitrary, because say-so without reasons to back it up is essentially arbitrary. And therefore, I do not believe that it is a good justification. I believe that attempts to ground morality in the will of God, or the will of the government for that matter, which is just the other side of the same coin, is inevitably definitional. It just says, well, this word morality, we are going to equate it by definition with whatever God says is right, or whatever the government says is right. And ultimately, that robs the word morality of any real meaning on its own. For instance, when in the Bible, in the Old Testament, God orders Saul to murder every single living thing in Amalek, including the women and the infant children and the cattle, and Saul does this, except he takes one of the best cattle, and instead of slaughtering it, makes an offering of it to God. God condemns and punishes Saul for disobeying him. Now, from the standpoint of morality, and I think everybody, no matter what philosophical background they come from, will acknowledge that genocide is wrong, irrespective of who does it, who orders it, or for what reasons it is being committed. God has ordered Saul to commit an atrocity.
Yet from those who say morality is defined as the will of God, well, there seems to be nothing wrong with genocide. At that point, the people who would truly back up God's command to Saul would have to drop any pretense of morality and just say, well, we obey the will of this powerful being, right or wrong. Well, I have a different view. I think in order to obtain a legitimate grounding for morality, we need to ask, what is morality or ethics? Ethics deals with the question, what ought we do? We as human beings. Ethics is necessarily a human-centered discipline because we can control our own actions. We cannot directly control, say, the actions of another animal because we are not that animal. We cannot directly control the actions of a rock unless we exert some kind of physical force on that rock. So we cannot frame questions like, what should the animal do, or what should the rock do, without asking ourselves, well, what should we do to the rock or the animal to get them to do what we think they should do? So ultimately, with ethics, we start with ourselves. Without us being able to ask the question, what should we do, ethics becomes a meaningless enterprise. And we need to ask, well, what are the prerequisites of us asking the question, what should we do? Naturally, inanimate objects or dead people cannot ask that question. So the fundamental prerequisite seems to be being alive. Now, of course, that's necessary, but that's not sufficient, because aside from being alive, we have to also have the ability to ask that question. A lot of living things do not have that ability. So we have to have volition. We have to have the ability to choose to ask the question, what should we do? And we also have to have the physical faculties that enable us to ask it, either the faculty of speech, or the ability to ask the question in writing, or the ability to pose that question through some other medium, say through an art form, if one is capable of doing that. And in order to ask the question at all, we need to possess the faculty of reason, which enables us to formulate this kind of proposition. So, ethics has certain prerequisites, which it would be inconsistent for an ethical system to try to subvert or undermine. Just as in any system, there are certain starting premises or axioms that you cannot contradict within the framework of that system. Say, in logic, one of the axioms would be the law of identity. A equals A, and A cannot be not A at the same time and in the same respect. Because if you allow one contradiction, A being not A, within a logical system, then you can prove anything whatsoever within that system, and it becomes absolutely meaningless. So within an ethical system, the axioms, if we wish to look at it that way, are the prerequisites for that system to exist in the first place, namely that we, the human agents who are developing this system, must be alive, we must be volitional agents, and we must have the faculty of reason that enables us to formulate these kinds of value judgments. So the first goal of the ethical system, of our quest in asking what should we do, well, we should preserve the preconditions of our asking what should we do. That is, we should try to remain alive, we should try to remain volitional agents, we should try to remain capable of having a choice of asking that question, and we should try to embrace and cultivate our rational faculty, because our rational faculty is what enables us to delve into ethics. So, at the point at which you believe that
some kind of morality is necessary, and the question what ought one do has any kind of meaning, you implicitly embrace the desirability of life, volition, and rationality. And those are the starting points. And I believe with those starting points, you can really get quite far in your ethical system, because your life is not just something abstract, ethereal, immaterial. It is quite concrete and physical, and it has very definite prerequisites. If you want to live, you need to eat, you need to sleep, you need to find a way of making a living and supporting yourself. You need to use your mind and innovate and adapt to your surroundings as well as adapt your surroundings to yourself. And you need to use that rational faculty to enable you to survive. So all of these are implications of the necessary embracing of life as the starting point of your ethical system. Now, to be consistent, you cannot just say your own life is the ultimate goal of the ethical system, though it is, I believe, the most important goal, because if you're not alive, you can't make ethical systems at all. But if other human beings have the same essential nature as you, then if you deny them the right to life, if you deny them the right to be free, volitional, rational agents, then you have just robbed yourself of any claim to these same prerogatives. Because why should you have them if other entities that have the same essential nature as you are not allowed to have them? That's inconsistent. That's a contradiction. So, in embracing an ethical system, you necessarily implicitly affirm the desirability of your own life and the desirability of the lives of every single innocent individual who has not infringed on the lives and liberties of others. So therein lies the starting point of morality. In my previous presentation, I showed that life, the life of every single individual, is necessarily the starting point for a moral system that has a rational foundation to it. Now, you are in need of a moral system. Why? Because you are alive right now, and you have implicitly, if not explicitly, chosen life over death. Now, the alternative of life versus death is the alternative that is faced by every living thing, human beings included. Animals face it too, but the animals largely don't really have a choice about whether or not to pursue life. A lot of their faculties are pre-programmed into them in the form of what are called instincts. The animals act by default in such a way as to pursue life within the limited cognitive and physical abilities that they have. And very few animals choose not to pursue life. And so, for many of them, this alternative is not really something that requires a lot of contemplation. For human beings, it's a bit different, but nonetheless, if you are watching this video right now, and if you are not choosing to drop dead at this very moment by depriving yourself at this very instant of the preconditions for life, then you're implicitly choosing life. Now, at the point at which you say, well, I decide to choose death instead of life, but then you try to go about some kind of time-consuming process in pursuing your own death, you're committing a bit of a contradiction. Because what do you need to do in order to, say, commit suicide? In order to get a knife and stab yourself, or get a gun and shoot yourself, or hang yourself, or commit one of the other perverse acts people do to commit suicide? Well, you need to make physical movements to do that, and you need to make them over a span of time. You need to use your mind
in order to coordinate those physical movements? And what business do you have in trying to use life and rationality to achieve the opposite of life and rationality, namely death, and the complete lack of thought, complete lack of awareness that it entails? You're using A in order to try to get non-A, which is quite a contradiction. So, the person who tries to commit suicide is inconsistent on his own premises, in the sense that he implicitly embraces life and he explicitly seeks death. The only way that you can make a fully consistent choice to pursue death is to just drop dead, at which point, yes, you will have no need for morality, and at which point nobody will have the power to stop you. Now, also granted, if somebody really, really wants to commit suicide, and he makes repeated attempts, it's unlikely that even the most vigilant other people will be able to stop him. There's no real practical way to prevent a determined suicidist from committing suicide. But, if you're watching this video, and if you're wondering about morality, I'm assuming you probably don't want to commit suicide. So, you've chosen life rather than death. And I think this choice is a very important choice, no matter where your other philosophical preferences lie. I don't require, in embracing this moral system, that you be an atheist like I am. You could very well believe in a god and an afterlife, or many gods, or the Hindu version of Brahman and merging yourself with Brahman in the afterlife, or the Buddhist vision of nirvana. So long as you believe that this life has value, and that you are going to pursue this life over death in every situation where you can make a choice that will influence the course of affairs, then you and I have some common ground in establishing an ethical system. Now, I believe there are 3 tiers of morality that need to be considered and that follow from embracing life. First of all, a truly moral person will not inflict harm upon the lives of others. This is the first tier of morality, because by damaging other human beings intentionally and directly, one is robbing oneself of any rational justification for one's own right to life and one's own right to liberty, because other human beings have the same essential nature. They too are able to contemplate ethical systems. They too have a volitional faculty and a rational faculty, and to deprive them of that would then beg the question, well, why in the world are you insisting that you have these rights if you don't grant them to people who are in essence like you? So this is the first tier of morality. Do no harm to others. The second tier of morality is do no harm to yourself. Do not engage in self-destructive actions such as suicide, or say the taking of life-endangering drugs, or engaging in risky behaviors against which you do not have adequate protection or adequate assurance that you will emerge from them alive. Now, this, of course, is left to individual judgment in many respects, because we need not only to consider a behavior in isolation, but how it relates to other behaviors. Good example I like to use is somebody who eats a chocolate cake of 600 calories a piece every single day, and he takes great pleasure in this. This probably wouldn't be good for his health, except every single day, to compensate for eating that piece of chocolate cake, he goes out to run for an hour and burns about 800 calories, which actually makes him expend more calories on net than he would have done had he not eaten that chocolate cake, because his running is solely motivated by a desire to compensate for eating that cake. So you need to consider context in deciding what is or is not self-destructive. The third tier of morality is the tier of civility and integrity. In how you relate to other people, you need to honestly represent yourself and carry through on your promises, and you need to be civil and tactful in your interactions with others, to never deliberately insult another person, to oppose another person's ideas with dignity and with courage, but not at the same time trying to denigrate that person or suggest that that person is somehow evil just for advocating those ideas. Once again, we need to distinguish between truth and falsehood in ideas versus good and evil in people. So civility and integrity, they are less important than doing no direct harm to others and doing no direct harm to oneself, but they are quite important nonetheless. And adherence to the third tier of morality is the capstone of ethics. Once you have the other two down, you work on the third, and that ensures harmonious, peaceful, mutually advantageous interactions among human beings. So this has been my brief overview of the origins of morality and some of its basic structure. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I look forward to your feedback.
There's a widespread view regarding the origin of natural rights, which I believe is a flimsy and ultimately insufficient view for justifying the existence of natural rights. It is the so-called authority-based view of rights, popular both with the left and with the right today. The version preferred by the right is that the authority that grants rights to people is God. Even the great John Locke fell prey to this fallacy. The version preferred by the left is that the authority that grants individuals natural rights is the society, or the government, and its representatives affirmed by some kind of legitimate due process. The problem with the authority-based view of rights is that it does not suffice in ascertaining and securing objective, universal, stable, and permanent natural rights. After all, what the authority gives, the authority can take away, by that same authority by which it allegedly gave the rights. This is no secure basis for any kind of lasting, reliable understanding of rights. For instance, God can change his mind. He has been known to change his mind according to the scriptures of various monotheistic religions. He has even changed his mind about the desirability of the Great Flood, which he allegedly deeply regretted, according to the book of Genesis. Furthermore, anyone's say-so has no necessary truth value, and the authority-based view of rights is ultimately grounded on the say-so of some kind of allegedly authoritative entity. Now, you can call a particular entity a god, a king, or an elected representative. It does not matter. It does not add one bit of truth value to that authority's pronouncements. Glorified names are no substitute for the truth, nor do they give their bearer infallibility. However much the advocates of the authority-based view of rights might assert the contrary. To ground rights on say-so is to ground them arbitrarily, and therefore unstably. The only way to obtain a secure understanding of natural rights that cannot be revoked under any circumstances, is to recognize that natural rights do not come to human beings from any external source, be it a divine source or a human source. Natural rights, as the term might suggest, exist in human beings by virtue of their nature, i.e., by virtue of what human beings are. Rights do not come from any kind of external source. Indeed, the verb come from is simply not applicable to the concept of rights. Unfortunately, the English language is much more flexible in terms of what one can do with it than is reality, so it is possible to combine subjects and verbs in a nonsensical manner. For example, one could make a statement such as, virtue eats. Now, the verb eats, one will clearly recognize, is not applicable to a concept like virtue. It makes no sense to make a statement such as virtue eats. Similarly, it makes no sense to make a statement like rights come from anything, because the verb come from is just not applicable to the concept of rights. Rights do not come from, they simply are. Humans have rights by virtue of being human, by virtue of certain faculties that they have, including, according to some, their rationality, their ability to make choices regarding their actions, their volitional consciousness. They start having rights when they are conceived. They continue to have limited rights even after they die, hence the validity of inheritances and bequests. An individual can say, I will leave my property to X, and it is his right to say so and have his wish honored even after his life no longer exists. Furthermore, there is no necessary need for authority in order to enforce rights. Now granted, rights can be violated in this imperfect world of ours. It is possible for an individual to kill another individual in flagrant violation of his right to life. It is possible for some individuals to confiscate the property of other individuals in flagrant violations of their right to property. However, it does not follow that some single unitary authority must be the enforcer of all rights. Indeed, originally, every man, being himself the possessor of natural rights, is their first arbiter. He himself can decide which situations his rights apply to and when they have been violated. This is his original authority, as Locke describes it in the state of nature. Now, sometimes it may be difficult to provide enforcement using that kind of model in practice. So sometimes, indeed quite frequently, people voluntarily make the choice of delegating the enforcement of their rights to some authority. However, this authority's power to enforce rights, to arbitrate disputes, and sometimes to use force in resolution of disputes that cannot be otherwise resolved, derives from that original delegation. This authority cannot arrogate to itself any kinds of powers other than those which have been explicitly delegated to it by every individual under its jurisdiction. So, there can be a place for authorities such as governments in adjudicating disputes and enforcing natural rights. But the choice to subject oneself to such a system must always be made willingly by each individual. And one can dispute, of course, what constitutes a willing choice. Political philosophers have been having that conversation for at least 4 centuries. And different advocates of natural rights will disagree as to what constitutes consent. However, it is a fundamental principle of natural rights that that kind of consent and that kind of delegation is always necessary. No authority can just spring up on its own and claim some external source, external to the individuals upon whom it exercises its jurisdiction, as the justification for its enforcement of somebody's alleged rights, or its violation of rights that actually exist. Furthermore, if it were true that a single unitary authority is necessary for the enforcement of rights, the advocate of such a position would to be consistent, need to advocate global government. Indeed, there are many governments on the earth today. None of these governments have authority over any other government necessarily. So, does that create some kind of problem? Is it somehow wrong that we have almost 200 nation-states instead of just one in the entire world? Was it wrong earlier in history, when there were even smaller nation-states and city-states and principalities? Was there somehow some kind of greater injustice in having that kind of enforcement of rights, rather than the one that we have today? I would allege that it is not necessarily more unjust to have more authorities of different kinds and different scopes enforcing rights, rather than to have fewer. It depends on the situation. It depends on the particular individuals claiming to be authorities, whether their authority is legitimate, whether their authority has been delegated to them, whether they actually exercise the powers that have been delegated to them and do not exceed the scope of those powers. Rights can be universal, they can be objective, they can be inalienable, without the need for an authority to originate the rights. Every person has natural rights. The question is, what does one do with them, and what does one do to protect and preserve them? And that is indeed the principal question of political philosophy, and it is a question whose resolution is essential for our time and for the peace, prosperity, and progress of humankind.